non-existent employers, untraceable workers and employees who were actually freelance. Of widespread fraud at the jobs agency A4e. Paul Mason investigates.
In this leaked report, evidence of systemic management failures at A4e. So why didn't civil servants get to see it?
Should this company be receiving your money and mine, or is it time for the government to show A4e the door? We'll have live reaction. Good evening. The company that's made millions out of welfare-to-work schemes is at the centre of a news storm tonight after a leaked report provided evidence of apparent fraud. A4e is already under investigation. This report came from its own auditors, who warned in 2009 that numerous cases where the company had supposedly got people into work and been paid for it by the government simply couldn't be backed up with evidence. The government's position has been that systemic fraud will mean the end of A4e's lucrative contracts. Well, our economics editor Paul Mason has been investigating.
Michelle, here's a company that makes money by putting unemployed people into jobs. It sends a man for a job, and after 2 hours he complains of sore feet and he leaves and he's never seen again. And later somebody signs a form saying he had a job for 13 weeks and the company claims money from the government for it. Now, this is either fraud or irregularity or bad practice, and we want to know what it is. Of course, this stuff happens in the best of companies, and what the government is concerned about is whether this was systematic at A4e. Well, this report that was leaked to us is full of such examples and more. What it says is that the company's management really were in danger of potentially systematic management failure to address these problems of fraud and irregularity. Time was, A4e was the poster child for the government's Back to Work programme. Mr Cameron made the company's boss his Back to Work advisor. A4e was paid £170 million a year by the government for training the unemployed and getting them into long-term jobs. The jobs were supposed to last at least 13 weeks, and the employers had to sign a form confirming the job was real and reasonably full-time, not just a few hours a week. In July 2009, A4e audited the work of its top 20 recruiters. These were supposed to be the best people, and the auditors only looked at the files of 224 clients. It's just a snapshot, but what they found was disturbing. In offices scattered all over the country, A4e's finest were claiming for putting people into jobs that didn't exist or didn't qualify for a payment from the government, and fabricating paperwork to back up the claims. The report details potentially fraudulent or irregular A4e claims. 3 in Edinburgh, 3 in Newcastle and 6 in Bridlington, 2 in Bootle, 2 in Manchester, 1 in Rotherham and 4 in Nottingham, as well as 3 in Norwich and 2 in Woolwich. And they could only be sure that everything was in order in 2/3 of the files they looked at. The report itself warns these are not isolated incidents. In Edinburgh, one client walked out after 2 hours, complaining of sore feet, and never appeared on the potential employer's books, but A4e still claimed the payment. In Bootle, the auditor could find no trace of an unemployed man who was supposed to have found work at the Royal Mail, and no trace of the man who was supposed to have employed him. In Bridlington, a cafe owner told the auditor that he had never even met a man A4e had claimed for, and he wanted to know why A4e kept asking him to sign blank forms. And in Woolwich, A4e appeared to have claimed for putting a benefits cheat back into the job he was already illegally working in. As the auditor says, this is a potentially fraudulent claim, and there is also potential benefit fraud. The auditors found that A4e staff thought there was, quotes, nothing wrong with filling in forms that should be completed by the employer. The auditors said 4% of the claims put in by A4e's best recruiters were potentially fraudulent, and another 12% were risky. The auditors could only be sure that A4e were entitled to the money they'd claimed in 70% of the cases. This is what the Deputy Prime Minister told Parliament last week.
We've now launched our own audit of the existing contracts which A4e has received from government. And if there's any evidence of systematic abuse, then of course we would end all contracts with A4e.
Critics will say the report appears to provide the evidence of precisely this. It warns potential fraudulent or irregular activity is not confined to one particular geographical area and shows a potential systematic failure to mitigate the risk towards this behaviour. Of course, the majority of claims surveyed, as well as some of A4e's offices and some of A4e's recruiters, were given a totally clean bill of health. But although the report was written in 2009, we found 2 of those linked with potential fraud still working at A4e today. The report back then said management information in relation to the effectiveness of existing controls is minimal. A4e said the document was not the final draft and that they had determined that only 5 claims were irregular and related to 1 former employee, and that they'd repaid the government less than £5,000. A4e wouldn't give us an interview. The DWP told us they never saw the document. They were made aware of the audit and later received assurances from A4e that it had not uncovered any major issues. Well, Michelle, those statements there from the company and from the DWP do leave a lot of questions unanswered. What did A4e actually do if these were the problems? But I think beyond all this, there is a question for the politicians, for Labour, who started this process and hired them originally, and for the coalition now. To read this report is to immerse yourself in a world of people worried sick, without jobs, who are being sent to minicab firms, lap dancing clubs, bars, low-waged employment in general. They have very little power, and the people who are doing the work, by and large, doing as best as they can, the trainers and the recruiters, under extreme pressure to get them into jobs. The government does not want to come out and play tonight and talk about this, and it hasn't in recent days, but it's going to have to, because it has a duty of care to those tens and hundreds of thousands of unemployed people who are right now, today and tomorrow, going through the portals of this company's operation.
Paul, thank you very much. Let's try and answer some of those questions at least. No one from the Department for Work and Pensions or indeed from A4e was available for interview tonight, but with us in the studio is Margaret Hodge MP, who's the chair of the Public Accounts Committee. What did you think watching Paul's report?
Well, I think it's a shocking catalogue of incidents which suggests it's not contained in one area of the country, and it's not about one little group of employees. It seems to me that if the company obviously saw this report, and if I was a manager in that company, and if I really had any moral integrity, I would have shared the entire contents with the department. I'd have come clean and I'd have made absolutely clear what I was doing to put things right. This company gets hundreds of millions of pounds of taxpayers' money, your money and my money, and to think that on the back of that the directors are becoming multi-millionaires and individuals who are desperate for jobs and not being given a good service is not acceptable.
There are clearly some pretty eye-opening examples in this. There's the auditors turning up to the employers' premises just don't exist. There's the employers who are being asked to fill out blank forms by A4e employees. The key question, though, is the test that the government has set, which is whether or not there is systemic fraud. From what you've heard today, do you think there is systemic fraud?
I've looked at the report. I have absolutely no doubt that this is a systemic issue throughout the company. It was my committee that first highlighted the problems in A4e, and I must say that since we discussed it, I've had over 100 emails from individuals who are either clients there or people who've worked there, and what comes out to me out of this is that I think the company appears to have been really greedy. You see that a little bit in the Emma Harrison paying herself a dividend of £8.6 million. I think there's a bullying culture there, and I think in that culture people were cutting corners and there was some cheating going on. And I have to say, from the point of view of the government has consistently said that if there is evidence of systemic fraud, that they would stop the contract.
Yes. So is that what you think should happen right now, today, on the basis
I have been saying for some time that I think those contracts should be suspended. I wrote today to the Permanent Secretary in DWP asking him yet again to suspend the contracts with A4e. He's not done so, and I think this has a wider impact, because if we don't sort this out, everybody will lose trust in the system as a whole. This is a new programme. There are literally hundreds of millions of pounds being put into the private sector. If there isn't proper transparency and openness and confidence, we will lose trust in an absolutely key programme to get people back into work.
Both DWP and the statement from A4e are making is that both of them seem to regard this as historic. This report came from 2009. Happening today?
Well, among the 100 emails and letters I've had, there are people who are complaining about the work programme. We know that the DWP is investigating and the police are investigating allegations around the present work programme. And what I think is this really important point. The work programme is a new programme. It's going to be run by a whole lot of private providers in a sort of black, where there's not going to be very detailed vigilance of how they spend the money. I think it is hugely important. It's taxpayers' money. This is hugely important. Yeah. There's proper transparency, proper openness, so that you and I can be secure in the knowledge that these hundreds of millions of pounds is properly paid.
The key now is whether the checks are in place on this big new contract, the work programme. So that's why we need to know, did ministers know about this report when they signed off on those contracts? And second, have they got the right checks in place today? Because we heard a few weeks ago the incredible news that the government's counter-fraud system for the work programme isn't actually in place until April.
Okay,
that tells us that the checks aren't in place.
Well, we're talking about a geographical spread of these allegations right across the country. 6 cases in Bridlington, 4 in Nottingham, 3 in Edinburgh, 2 in Woolwich. The list goes on and on. So,
now, ministers have said that if they do find evidence of systemic fraud, they will suspend the contract.
But looking at the evidence that we have presented tonight, do you believe, as Margaret Hodge believes, that this is a systemic failure and systemic fraud?
I think the onus is now on A4e and ministers to satisfy Parliament and taxpayers that this has come to an end and that there isn't the same problem on this massive new contract in the work programme. Because ministers like to boast that it's what they call a black box contract. That means it's pretty hard to know what's going on inside. And of course there's a much bigger incentive on companies to just get people into jobs or to claim that they've got people into jobs, because that's now the only way that they get paid. So if you like, the stakes are much higher for companies. The rewards of fraud are therefore much greater, therefore the check should be much tougher. And I'm very worried that DWP has had to confess that the checks for the work programme won't be in place until the end of April.
But Margaret Hodge wants to see these contracts pulled now because she doesn't believe that this is a fit recipient of public money. Are you making the same call tonight or not?
Well, I'm taking a slightly different position, which is that I think that ministers need to come forward to Parliament very, very urgently now and say, did they know about this report when they awarded the contracts? That's a matter of enormous public concern. And second, what is the result of their internal investigation? We know that they haven't got a checking system in place because they apparently forgot to build it. We need to know now, what has their investigation shown? This is a matter of massive public concern.